Dear students, welcome to Swayam Shikshaa. So welcome to our current affairs snapshot. Today we are going to discuss on one important article which has come up in newspaper, that is the Fiscal Rethink. Now the budget was out and we were in troubles during the COVID pandemic in the sense of public expenditure. That means how we have to spend money, that is how government has to spend money. So in this context, this particular article talks about, one is Article 293 of the Constitution, which clearly talks about the states taking permission of the center with respect to their borrowings. So that means the states are indebted to the center with respect to making borrowings. But there was one important recommendation that was made in the 12th Finance Commission, that the state's indebtedness to center with respect to borrowing should be removed and the state should be allowed to borrow money from the market. That means the state should have the freedom enough freedom to borrow money from the market. So this discussion was there, especially in the context of the budget, where the center was talking about 50 years interest-free loans to the state. So this particular aspect which was discussed in the budget, that is the center giving 50 years interest-free loans to the states, wherein the states can use this loan amount mainly for capital expenditure, that is building infrastructure, etc. Now this is an important aspect which has to be reconsidered and checked, because when the states are going to put more money into capital expenditure, then definitely there would be a higher multiplier effect. So this particular article also says that the capital expenditure has a higher multiplier effect in comparison to the revenue expenditure. That's definitely true. But at the same time, this article also specifies one more important aspect. It talks about UK in the sense that in UK, there is no restriction on fiscal deficit targets as such, especially as long as you are spending it on capital expenditure. So as long as you are focused on creating assets, as long as you are spending money on capital expenditure, such restrictions are not there. And that is basically the UK's model, which is also mentioned in this particular article. Now, one more important aspect here talks about the economics viewpoint. The Economist's viewpoint of capital expenditure is quite different from what we talk about in the budget as far as capital expenditure is concerned. For example, the loans given by the central government are also seen as capital expenditure. But here specifically, the definition of capital expenditure by the economists, they feel, so we are only focusing on spending on infrastructure or this capital expenditure. We don't want to take into consideration something like the loans given. So this particular article also talks about this aspect, where how do you look at this capital expenditure. So in the subsequent years, how is India going to spend more on capital expenditure to revive the Indian economy on a long-term basis? That long-term basis, so how do you handle it? So this is what this article basically talks about. Okay, so now talking about the article here, basically what we will try to understand here is, one important aspect is enhancing capital expenditure. Obviously, that is one important aspect, because capital expenditures have higher multiplier effect in comparison to revenue expenditure. But at the same time, this article says the programs like MGNREGS, government has reduced the amount of money it is going to spend as far as the budget is concerned. But at the same time, it clearly mentions that the government should be adequately careful enough when it is trying to reduce subsidies with respect to food. Number one, food subsidies, because we are just out of the COVID pandemic. And at the same time, government clearly specifies that we also have to focus on not reducing our subsidies, rather focus on increasing subsidies with respect to social security schemes. So two more important aspects. So you can't just take a decision on reducing revenue expenditures just like that. We need to be little more cautious, especially with respect to spending on food, number one. And number two, spending money on something like the social security schemes, because social security schemes play a critical role, especially after the COVID pandemic. Now, going by the numbers here, So we know that we have not abided by the principles of FRBM, Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act targets in the recent past. And that was mainly because of the COVID scenario. Nothing wrong. But here what we observe is in 2020-21, the fiscal deficits have almost touched 9.2%. So this is something like a fact which you should understand. So we are way above the FRBM targets, way above the FRBM targets of 3%. And then what we have set is, we have set a target saying that, yes, we will focus on reducing the fiscal deficit to almost like 6.4% by 2022-23. So this is one more important aspect. So the target is going to be brought down to 6.2% by 2022-23. And of course, we were also saying that by the time of 2025, we are going to bring down our fiscal deficit targets to almost like 4.5. But that also is above FRBM. Now, the logic here is, though the fiscal deficit targets are high, is it okay that if the fiscal deficit targets are on a higher side for a very long period, then what is the negative? So there would be one negative, obviously. For a very long period, if FDs are high, the government is borrowing, etc., it will lead to crowding out effect of the private investment. So this article also says a long period, if you are resorting to fiscal deficit, continuously increasing fiscal deficit, then it can crowd out private investment. So that's a caution statement which we find in this particular article. So very important caution statement there. Be very careful with respect to very long periods of FDs because it can crowd out the private investment. So that's a very important aspect which we see in this particular article. Now in this particular article, again, another important aspect, very important aspect which we find is, it talks about the debt to GDP ratios. Of course, according to FRBM targets, our debt to GDP ratio should be around 40.2, but we find that the center's debt to GDP ratio, the debt, the borrowings, around 60.2. It's on a higher scale. Now, some economists talk about comparing India with Japan, whose debt to GDP ratios are far higher than this 60%. But there is a difference between Japan and India. When we talk about debt to GDP ratios, that difference is discussed, which is very important. In Japan, if we try to observe, okay, so in Japan, the interest payments on debt constitute only 4.7% of their revenue receipts. So though your debt to GDP ratios are high, the major chunk of your debt is not going into interest payments. It's hardly 4.7% of the revenue receipts. So your debt, the debt of Japan, is quite okay. But when we talk about India, okay, so our interest payments in 2022-23 is almost like 42.7%, 4% there, 42.7% of the revenue receipts. So this clearly shows that most of your borrowings, that is your FD, is getting into interest payments, and it is not going to do the right job of building infrastructure if this continues. Now, it's a caution. So you can't compare with countries like Japan, saying that the Japan has debt to GDP ratios higher than India, because the scenarios are quite different. So this is one more important aspect which is discussed in this particular article. So going forward, against this background, so this article says, we can just rethink on this 50-year interest-free loans given by the center, which is to the states, which is clearly discussed in the budget, because there is no interest payments linked to the states. So states can spend it on capital expenditure for a long period. So that's one important thing. And in this background, it tries to support the 12th five-year plan, where the states need not be indebted to the center, and states should have their autonomy in terms of raising money from the market. So they should be given the freedom to raise money from the market. Along with this, it also talks about a recommendation given in the 12th Finance Commission, where they wanted to set up a loan council committee. This again comes up into news now. That is setting up a loan council committee which comprises the government, the states and the RBI, that can take basically proper decisions on how states should be allowed to borrow. So how states should be allowed to borrow is decided by this loan council committee, which was suggested by the 12th Finance Commission. So we can get back and look into this particular suggestion of the 12th Finance Commission with respect to managing our debt, especially with respect to the states. So this is what is this particular article about, is all about. I hope you like the article. Please do subscribe to our channel for more such videos, and do spread our YouTube channel to serious aspirants, and let's work together. Signing off. Thank you.